Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 52 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have lost 1-0. And this was going to be a very difficult game to predict the result of coming into it, not necessarily because of the two teams that were up against each other. Obviously, smart money's on Winnipeg just because they are a much better team than San Jose. But in my case, the reason I'm saying this is because the Sharks are coming off just about a 2-week break, thanks to a combination of the All-Star break as well as the annual bye week for the San Jose Sharks. And with this much time off, you never know how a team is going to show up. When it is two back-to-back games, you realize that that team is likely going to be rather tired. When there's like one day off between two games, that's the norm, and you're kind of expected to be able to turn back around pretty quickly. When you have 2 to 3 days off, that's a good amount of rest, but you kind of stay within the game frame, and as such, it is actually quite useful. But once you get up to those 4 days off, 5 days off, and of course for the Sharks, 13 days off between games, that's when it becomes very difficult to really stay in the NHL grind, and you end up kind of relaxing a bit too much and vacationing a bit too much, and so that could be something that goes wrong for the team, and that definitely seemed to be the case here tonight. While it may not look as much on the scoreboard as the Jets only with a single goal here tonight, and of course the Sharks not being able to get one, but it still seems like a close game. But this was anything but a close game when you look a bit deeper into this one. Just taking a look at the high danger opportunities in this one, the Sharks had 7, which is honestly maybe even slightly more than what it felt as though they had. But the Jets, on the other hand, had 24, more than triple the high danger chances that the San Jose Sharks had. In fact, the only good news for San Jose from this game is that through the first few minutes of the first period, the Sharks were actually out shooting the Jets. They got the first 4 shots on net, including one pretty decent chance to score. But from that point onward, it was truly all Winnipeg. In fact, the rest of the first period, the Sharks would not manage to generate even a single shot on net from that point onwards, and it was the Jets who would get 15 straight to end off the opening frame and would add the only goal of this game from Barron to make it 1-0 Winnipeg. In the second and then subsequently the third period, neither team would actually manage to score, but it was pretty much entirely Winnipeg Jets controlled. And the way you can really tell which team is dominating a game is when you take a look at the last few minutes of the third period, and if the team that is trailing at that point isn't actually able to get into the zone and generate chances, that means that this game is incredibly lopsided, and that was exactly the case here for the San Jose Sharks. It felt as though the last 5 minutes of the game, the Sharks basically did not hold the puck until maybe 30 seconds left or so, when they finally got something established in the offensive zone, but it didn't actually lead to any great chances on net. Hellebuck did not have to be all that great here tonight, besides a couple of moments, and in the end, the Sharks, while it is close on paper, this was not really all that close of a game, and it was quite clear that many of these Sharks players may have still had their minds in Hawaii compared to in Winnipeg. Very different climates. You'd think that maybe that would spark them awake, but it did not, and indeed the Sharks lose. Moving on to the players to talk about, obviously we have a pretty different view of the Sharks forward lineups due to some people returning from injury as well as some people leaving with injury. With both Hurdle and Couture out of the lineup, we're getting a bit of a different view of the Sharks' top 6. The top line here is Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund. Now, while these 3 players have played together many times this season, it never really feels like a super dominant line. I've brought this up so many times in the past when it comes to these 3 players, is that they are able to generate chances. That is definitely not up for debate. They will get like 1 or 2 at least high danger chances per game, but it's never really a line that you're super happy with, and I think this really starts with Mikael Granlund. When the Sharks originally acquired Granlund from the Pittsburgh Penguins, I had drawn a comparison, obviously much lower, but still, to Joe Thornton, because Granlund was a very good playmaker back when he was, of course, in his prime with the Minnesota Wild. But one thing that Granlund doesn't really have, at least currently, maybe back in the day it was the case, but one thing that he doesn't really have that Thornton had in spades is that ability ability to truly just slow down the game and dominate the ice when he's on for a shift. At the end of a Granlund shift, there are definitely many times where you're saying like, wow, look at that amazing pass that he made. That was a crazy play. But there were very few times where he'll exit the ice and you said, wow, Granlund was just completely all over it on that particular shift. And that definitely rubs off on these two other players, because when it comes to a player like, for instance, Anthony Duclair, and that was, of course, apparent here tonight and has been apparent the entirety of this season, Duclair is also not someone who's just going to absolutely dominate on a particular shift, and is much more so of a player who is able to capitalize on chances, a player who is extremely quick to be able to get those breakaway 2-on-1 type of opportunities, but is not going to be forechecking it and working it super hard in the offensive zone to really force an opportunity on net. And while I do think Zetterlund can be that type of player, he is kind of more moving, at least recently, into kind of like a shooting type of finisher role, which is definitely not exactly going to be that forechecking force that this line absolutely needs. And so what it comes down to is that these three players all kind of play the very same way, which means they don't exactly complement themselves exceptionally well. I still think, of course, it makes a fine line, but maybe not the best of the best. That's just, of course, my opinion. Maybe David Quinn likely indeed has a different opinion about it, but that's just the way I view these three players. When it comes to the second line, we have Eklund joined by Barabanov and Cunnin. So of course, due to the injuries of Hurdle and Couture, Eklund forced to once again get the center ice position. And this was a game that was not great for sure for Eklund. It was obviously an extremely tough game in general for all of these players. It was played primarily in the defensive zone. There were only a few chances for San Jose. Otherwise, you're defending most of the time. Eklund, I will say, I believe had 2 or 3 solid shifts where I thought he made some great plays and definitely drove this line forward, came very close to scoring back in the early parts of the game. I think they had the good chance that could have perhaps turned the game around if the Sharks indeed scored to make it 1-0 early, but because that didn't happen, the rest is history. But otherwise, Eklund didn't exactly get a ton going here. And the same would go for his 2 line mates as well. Barabanov had a really nice play in the early parts of the game, which was nice to see, and I thought maybe with that time off, Barabanov would like sort of turn over a new leaf and maybe get some value up for the upcoming trade deadline in a couple of weeks, but that just was not going to happen. After that nice play early on, it became more or less invisible for the rest of the game, and the same would go for Luke Cunnin, who I don't think was bad here tonight. I will say at the very least that, but he clearly wasn't very good either. Then it comes to the third line. We have Hoffman, Sturm, and McDonald. So McDonald gets the spot here on this third line. You'll notice that Kevin Labanc, even with multiple injuries hitting San Jose, does not manage to still draw into the lineup. So that is probably not the best mentally when a defenseman is beating you out. But when it comes to this third line, I mentioned, of course, Couture Hurdle missing tonight's game. Nico Sturm would then also go down with an injury at some point as he gets a massive hit from Logan Stanley. At the same time, Sturm seemed to be somewhat off balance, which meant that he ends up falling over, hitting his head hard, pretty hard on the ice, and has to leave. He's not unconscious or anything, so it doesn't look completely disastrous, but it's clearly not a great situation for the San Jose Sharks to now lose 3 of their top 4 natural centers at this point being out of the lineup. So if Eklund was looking forward to ever going back to the wing, it doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Prior to that, this third line, honestly, not really generating much of anything. I think they had like 1 good shift where they got some decent offense, but otherwise, Mike Hoffman, pretty invisible, McDonald, pretty invisible, Sturm, not doing too much, so generally not a great game for the third line. And then when it comes to the fourth line, it is quite similar here. Carpenter, Zadina, Justin Bailey, a pretty usual fourth line look that we have seen from the San Jose Sharks many times. It seemed pretty apparent that David Quinn did not want to disrupt any sort of chemistry and was just plugging the holes that he absolutely needed to. Here tonight, these fourth line players, honestly, not really doing much of anything. Then we get to the defensive side of things. Now, at the top here, it should be mentioned that considering the Jets got 24 high danger chances, they doubled up on the shots on goal against the San Jose Sharks here, and we're playing in the offensive zone like 70% of this game. It's pretty clear that none of these defensemen are going to be outstanding shutdown players here on the night, but that's not to say that there's not a best and worst pairing. So starting off at the top, due to some still lingering injuries, of course, to Henry Thrun, the top pairing is Ferraro and Ruda. So Ruda had been previously playing with Mukhamadullin, at least after the Thrun injury. Prior to that, he was playing with Henry Thrun, now being joined by Mario Ferraro as the Sharks' top defensive pairing. And I thought these guys did an okay job relative to the rest of the defense. You know, there were obviously some times where they were very much hemmed into their own zone and kind of read the play a bit incorrectly, leaving some players in front of the net completely unopposed. But I would say generally, I thought Ruda had a decently solid game. Ferraro also pretty good. Again, this is relative to the rest of the defensive performances, and so not terrible for this top group. When it comes to the second defensive pairing, we have Vlasic as well as Ty Emberson. Now, Vlasic, there were definitely somewhat of some worries coming into tonight's game, just based on how he has played recently, which has been very, very good. He was on a massive hot streak, not just in terms of points, but just playing generally much better defensively. And I was worried that the 2 weeks off with the sort of coming out of game speed, vacationing, relaxing a bit, would actually ruin that stretch, and we'd end up back with the early season Marc-Edouard Vlasic. But that actually didn't end up happening. Vlasic was one of, if not the best defenseman once again for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. This is not to say that he was great. Once more, I do have to clarify that so that nobody's necessarily going to come in and say, well, Vlasic, how could you say that when he's so hemmed into his own zone? That is absolutely true. There's no arguing that, but relative, again, to every other defenseman on the team, I thought Vlasic was hemmed into his zone less than many of the other players. And that also does have something to do with Ty Emberson, who has been a very strong complementary defenseman to many players throughout the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. He has played with Ferraro, he has played now with Vlasic, and it's just generally seemed to always go at least pretty well with whichever pairing he happens to be on. Now, where is it where it kind of went disaster for San Jose? That is, of course, with the Sharks' third defensive pairing. As is usually the case, we have here Addison and Burrows, and these two players just not particularly good at all. Kalen Addison, I mean, everybody knows my feelings about Kalen Addison at this point this season. This game did not do much to change that. The 2 weeks off that the Sharks had did not do much to change that. He's just not particularly good here with this team, and that is continuing forward. And Kyle Burrows, I've mentioned in the past, is very much the type of player who he might look good with like a decent partner, but when he's playing with someone like Addison or like a Hutchuk, he definitely struggles significantly. That's definitely a criticism you can give towards Burrows. And here tonight, while I thought he was better than Addison for sure, still not that great. And then finally, we get to the goaltender, Kaapo Kähkönen, who had, obviously, a fantastic game for the San Jose Sharks, letting in just a single goal, facing off against 24 high danger chances and making the saves on the vast majority of them. The only goal he let in was just off of a strange deflection in front. Very difficult save for him to otherwise make, but he's for over 40 saves, just doing fantastically. And what is this very important is that this helps boost up Kaapo Kähkönen's trade value. In case the Sharks were actually looking into trading one of their goaltenders, Kaapo Kähkönen may very well end up being the choice for the San Jose Sharks because of his expiring contract at the end of the season. And this game only helps his value shoot up even more against not only a tough Winnipeg Jets team, but a tough Winnipeg Jets team that caved the Sharks into their own zone. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will be taking on the Calgary Flames. We will likely see Blackwood in net for that one, since it is a back-to-back situation, and the Flames have been much better as of late, trying to make a late season push to the playoffs. We'll see if the Sharks manage to stand in their way or if they're just sort of pushed aside. Class dismissed.